a single father, a missing brother, a secret that powerful men buried under concrete and cash. And the one woman bold enough to pull up a chair and ask the question nobody else dared to ask. This is the story of a man who refused to stop waiting, and the woman who finally gave him a reason to believe the wait was worth it. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along and don't leave before the ending. Trust me, you'll want to be here for it. The rain came in hard that Thursday evening, the kind that turned the lake outside into a sheet of hammered iron and sent most people running for cover. But Mason Reed had never once let weather keep him from his table. He pulled into the gravel lot of Lakeview Diner at 6:58, 2 minutes early the way he always was, killed the engine on his beat-up Chevy pickup, and sat for a moment in the dark cab listening to rain beat against the roof. The wipers had stopped mid-drag and left a smear across his windshield that bent the diner's neon sign into something blurry and orange. He didn't move right away. He never did. There was always this 2-minute stretch where he just sat there and let the night settle around him before he went inside. A casual observer might have thought he was steeling himself, gathering courage for something difficult. They would have been right, even if they couldn't have named the thing he was bracing for. He got out into the rain without bothering with the jacket on the passenger seat, walked across the wet gravel and pushed through the diner's glass door, trailing water onto the worn linoleum. The bell above the door announced him. The smell hit him the same way it always did: fried oil and coffee and something sweet from the pie case near the register. Familiar enough by now that it felt less like a smell and more like a memory. "Corner table's open," said Diane, the Thursday night waitress, without looking up from the order she was writing. She was mid-50s, had worked this shift for 11 years, and had stopped formally seating Mason Reed somewhere around month 3 of his visits. "Thanks, Diane." He wound between tables and booths toward the back corner of the diner, the spot where 2 walls met and the window looked directly out over the lake. It was the worst table for service, farthest from the kitchen, awkward geometry, a drafty window in winter. But it had become so thoroughly Mason's that the Thursday staff had quietly adopted a policy of leaving it empty until 7, just in case. He settled into the chair with his back to the wall, the way his brother had taught him to always sit in public spaces. Face the room, know your exits. He hadn't thought about why he still did that for a long time. Now it surfaced only as a habit, automatic and persistent, one of those small inheritances you carry without meaning to. The diner was about half full tonight. A family of 4 in the booth by the door, the kids already fighting over a shared order of fries. 2 guys in work boots at the counter, talking with their mouths full about something that had gone sideways on a job site. An older couple near the pie case, eating in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that takes decades to build. The rain had thinned out the usual crowd, which Mason didn't mind. He wasn't there for company. Diane appeared at the table with a coffee carafe and turned over the second mug that was always already set out on that table, every Thursday, as standard now as salt and pepper. "Usual? Please." "Both plates?" She asked every week, not out of cruelty or curiosity anymore. Just consistency, the way she might ask if he wanted room for cream. It was part of the ritual now. His answer never changed. "Both plates." She nodded and moved off. Mason wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked out the window. The lake was invisible behind the rain and the dark, just a blurry sense of open space where the light stopped. He could hear it, though. The knock of water against the dock pilings, irregular and restless. This was the part of the evening he found hardest to describe, even to himself. The sitting, the waiting, not for anything specific, not with any genuine expectation that the door would open and a face he knew would walk through it. He wasn't delusional. He understood what 5 years of silence most likely meant. But understanding a thing and accepting it were different operations, and Mason Reed had always been better at the former than the latter. He thought about Ella. She was 8 now, almost 9, with her father's exact nose and a gap between her front teeth that the dentist had told them would close on its own by the time she was 12. She'd been 3 when Noah disappeared. Too young to have solid memories, but old enough that his absence had shaped something in her. Some low-level awareness of loss that she carried without fully knowing its name. She called Mason Dad, had been doing it since she was 4. He'd never corrected her and never would, but sometimes when she said it, he felt the word like a stone laid on top of another stone, something accumulated and heavy and also necessary. She was at home right now with Mrs. Kowalski from next door, probably already in pajamas, probably watching something she was technically too young for because Mrs. Kowalski's grasp of age-appropriate content had never been reliable. He'd texted before coming in, going to the diner, back by 9. Ella's response had been a thumbs up and a random string of cat emojis that meant nothing and everything. The food arrived faster than usual. Diane must have put the order in early. 2 plates of the same thing, what Mason always ordered. Chicken and waffles with a side of house slaw, the diner's Thursday special. He pushed the second plate to the other side of the table and adjusted it slightly, the way you might adjust a place setting for someone you were expecting. He ate slowly. Around him, the diner murmured with the ordinary sounds of a rainy weeknight. Someone at the counter laughed at something. The family by the door started the complicated project of getting young children into raincoats. The older couple paid their bill and stood with the careful deliberateness of people whose joints didn't cooperate the way they used to. The rain intensified for a stretch, drumming against the window glass, then eased back. Mason was about halfway through his meal, staring at the lake he couldn't see, when the bell above the door rang and a burst of wind-pushed rain came with it. He didn't look up immediately. He rarely did, but something in the way the room shifted made him glance over. A slight collective reorientation, the way a room full of people will unconsciously turn towards something unexpected. What he saw was a woman in a motorized wheelchair navigating through the door that a young man was holding open against the wind. She was managing the door frame with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had long since stopped having patience for spaces that weren't designed with her in mind. Her hair was dark and wet at the edges where her umbrella hadn't quite reached, and she was wearing something that looked formal. A fitted blazer, dress pants, heels she wore for aesthetics since her legs couldn't use them for their actual purpose. She'd been somewhere that required dressing up. Now she was here. She said something to the young man, a driver or an assistant, Mason guessed, and he pointed toward the sign by the register that said, "Please seat yourself on Thursdays." The woman looked around the diner, taking inventory of available tables with the quick assessment of someone used to evaluating spaces for practical realities. Most of the 2 tops were taken. The accessible table near the entrance was occupied by the work boots guys who had migrated over. Her gaze moved across the room. It landed on the corner table, on the empty plate across from Mason. He watched her roll toward him with a steady, unhurried pace that suggested she wasn't in a hurry and also wasn't unsure. She had a quality he'd have struggled to name, a directness, not aggressive but unambiguous, like someone who had decided at some point that life was too short for the wasted effort of indirection. She stopped at the edge of his table, looked at the untouched plate of food, looked at him. "Excuse me," she said. "Is someone joining you?" "No." She considered this for a second. "Do you mind if I—" "There are other tables." It came out flatter than he intended. She didn't flinch. "The other tables are either taken or inaccessible," she said, with zero edge in her voice, just information. "I'm not trying to intrude. I just need a place to sit and eat something before I lose my mind from this evening." Something in the exhaustion behind that last phrase, the specificity of it, the slight ragged quality underneath the polished exterior, made Mason look at her more carefully. Up close, she seemed younger than he'd initially thought. Late 20s, maybe. She had the kind of face that was hard to fully read, composed but not closed, like someone who had taught herself to keep things tidy at the surface without the surface being the whole story. He pulled the second plate slightly toward him, a small and probably unconscious protective gesture, then caught himself doing it. "Sit down," he said. She maneuvered the wheelchair to the open side of the table and settled there with the ease of habit. Up close, he could see the Charity Gala name badge still clipped to her lapel. Some children's hospital fundraiser, the kind of event that required attendance and conversation and sustained performance of being fine, which explained the "before I lose my mind" comment. She pulled off the badge and dropped it into her bag like she was relieved to be rid of it. Diane appeared, assessed the situation with the speed of someone who had seen most things, and produced a menu. The woman ordered black coffee and the chicken and waffles, the same thing Mason was eating, without looking at the menu, just reading it off the chalkboard special above the counter. Then she looked at the plate still sitting across from Mason, the untouched food, the adjusted place setting. She was quiet for a moment, which he appreciated. Most people went immediately for the question. She seemed to be deciding whether it was hers to ask. "Who are you still waiting for?" she said quietly. He looked at her. She wasn't being intrusive. Her voice had something in it, not pity, which he would have shut down, but something that felt more like recognition, like she was asking because she actually wanted to know and had some context for the kind of answer that might come. "My brother," he said. She nodded slowly, waiting. "He's been missing for 5 years." Another nod. No rush to fill the silence with condolences or hollow phrases. She just let it sit there. This was the last place he was seen, Mason said. He didn't know why he was telling her this. He almost never told anyone. "Every Thursday I come back. I don't know what I expect." "You don't have to expect anything," she said. "Sometimes keeping a place at the table is its own thing." He looked at her. "Arya Sterling," she said, and offered her hand across the table. He took it. "Mason Reed." Neither of them made anything of the name. Outside, the rain kept going. The lake stayed invisible behind the dark, and for the first time in nearly a year of Thursday evenings, Mason Reed ate his meal across from someone who wasn't a ghost. He didn't ask her to come back. She came back anyway the following Thursday at 7:15, still wearing something that looked like she'd come from somewhere formal and was stopping here on the way to becoming herself again. He was already at the corner table. The second plate was already in place. She looked at the situation, looked at him, and he didn't say anything that would have meant no, so she sat down. By the third week, it had become a thing neither of them discussed. She just came. He was already there. And for an hour or so, they talked about things that had nothing to do with charity galas or missing persons, and then she left and he finished his coffee alone and eventually went home. The honest truth was that Mason didn't fully know what to do with her. He was 30 years old and had spent the last 5 years so completely consumed by being a father and a keeper of vigil that he'd almost stopped thinking of himself as a person with ordinary social needs. His life ran on a track: work, pick up Ella, cook dinner, help with homework, Thursday diner, repeat. He had a couple of guys he'd grab a beer with occasionally, old friends who'd given up trying to bring him out of the shell they'd watched him build since Noah vanished. He was fine with his shell. It was functional. It kept the weather out. Arya Sterling was something the shell had not been designed for. She was sharp, not in the way that cut, though he'd learn later she could do that too, when circumstances required, but in the way that made you feel like the conversation was actually going somewhere rather than just burning time. She asked questions that assumed he was worth answering. She had opinions about things she held firmly, but the firmness came from actually thinking them through. And when he pushed back on something, she would pause and actually consider whether he had a point, which was rarer than it should have been. She was also, and he noticed this without judgment, just as information, clearly in some form of low-grade private pain that she was very good at keeping managed and almost invisible. He recognized the management because he practiced it himself. There were moments in conversation where something would flicker behind her eyes and then be quickly smoothed over, a practiced internal adjustment, the way you shift your weight off a bruise. He didn't ask about it for weeks. She didn't ask more about Noah either, beyond what he told her on the first night. The shape of it was out there between them, and some things you leave alone until the person on the other side decides to let you closer. What she did ask about during their fourth Thursday was Ella. He'd mentioned her in passing. "I have a niece, I'm raising her." And Arya had caught on the word raising in a way that meant she'd filed it and come back to it. "How old is she?" 8, almost 9. "What's she like?" Mason turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Stubborn, funny, way too smart for her own good. Or mine, anyway. She figured out I was lying about the tooth fairy when she was 5 because I'd been leaving the same denomination every time, and she said a real fairy would probably adjust for inflation." He paused. "I don't know where she gets that. Not from me." Arya smiled, a real one, the kind that changed her whole face, briefly, before she reeled it back in. "From her father?" "Probably. Noah was like that. Everything had to make sense to him. He couldn't leave a thing alone until it fit together the right way." "Is that why he got involved? In whatever he uncovered?" Mason looked at her. It was the most she'd pushed since the first night. "Yeah," he said. He was working property law. Low-level, mostly residential closings, nothing exciting, but he kept seeing these discrepancies in a parcel of commercial land out past the county line. Title transfers that didn't track right. Shell companies stacked on top of each other. He was the kind of person who, once he saw the shape of a thing, couldn't pretend he hadn't. What did he do with it? He went to the wrong people first, tried to report it internally. That was his mistake. Mason set down the mug. Within 2 weeks, he was telling me someone had followed him home. 3 weeks after that, he called me on a Tuesday night and said he needed me to take Ella for a few days. He sounded scared, really scared. And Noah didn't scare easy. He stopped. That was the last time I talked to him. Police found his car near this diner on the following Thursday. Reported him missing. Officially, the case went cold inside of 8 months. Arya was quiet for a moment. But you don't think he's dead? I think if they'd killed him, they would have made sure I knew about it, as a warning. He said it flatly, without theatrics. The fact that there was nothing, no body, no message, no cleanup, that always felt more like a disappearance than a death to me. You've been building a case. I've been trying. He shook his head. I'm a structural engineer, not an investigator. I don't have the tools or the access. I've hired 2 private investigators over the years. Neither of them found anything worth paying for. Arya looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read the look exactly. It was somewhere between thinking hard about something and deciding whether to say it. Who were the developers? She said. Company called Meridian Growth Partners. They rebranded twice since Noah disappeared. They're called Vantage Land Solutions now. Something moved across her face, quick, almost invisible, the flicker of a connection being made. Then it smoothed over. I've heard the name, was all she said. Tsitsin, Arya's world looked very different from Mason's. She ran a real estate and infrastructure development company called Sterling Capital Group, which she'd built from a mid-sized investment firm she'd inherited at 22 into something with a national footprint and a 9-figure portfolio. This was the version of her that existed in press releases and Forbes profiles and the charity gala name badges she hated wearing. The other version was the one she was still figuring out how to be. The car accident had happened 4 years ago, 2 months after her 23rd birthday. She'd been driving herself home from a late work session. She almost never drove herself, had a car and driver. But that night she'd been in a mood that needed motion and control and the particular freedom of being accountable to no one. A driver running a red light at 50 miles an hour had taken that freedom apart. She'd spent 6 months in hospitals and rehab facilities, had learned the full taxonomy of spinal cord injury, had had the conversation with the neurologist about permanence and adjustment and the words quality of life used in a way that made her want to throw something. Then she'd gone home, fired the live-in caregiver who treated her like a problem to be managed, promoted her most capable assistant into a role that combined personal and professional support, and got back to work. The outside world looked at Arya Sterling and saw someone who had handled it remarkably well. The outside world was seeing the performance. The truth was lonelier than that. The accident had clarified with brutal efficiency which relationships in her life had been real and which had been structural, built around what she represented, what access she provided, what proximity to money and influence meant for the other person. When the glamour of that access was complicated by a wheelchair and altered mobility and a life that didn't look the way it had before, people fell away. Some gracefully, some not. Her last serious relationship had ended 8 months after the accident. He'd said the right things throughout. I'm in this. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out together. And then gradually, incrementally, with the slow and terrible courtesy of someone who couldn't say the true thing, he'd gone anyway. That had probably hurt more than the accident itself, in some ways. At least the accident had been sudden. She told Mason some of this. Not all at once. It came out in pieces over weeks, the way things come out when you're not in the habit of telling them, and have to find the shape of it as you go. He was a good listener, not in the therapeutic, reflective listening way she'd experienced from actual therapists and from people trying to be therapists, but in the way of someone who had genuine capacity for sitting with a hard thing without needing to resolve it. He didn't rush to offer perspective or silver linings. He didn't do the things some people did where they grabbed onto your pain as a launching pad for their own comparable experience. He just listened and occasionally asked something that showed he'd actually heard what was underneath the words. One evening, about 6 weeks in, she told him about the people who'd left, the specific inventory of it, the board member who'd started CCing her deputy on emails without explanation, the old friend who'd become gradually, aggressively busy, the man she'd expected to stay who hadn't. She told it flatly, without self-pity, because self-pity was a habit she'd worked hard to root out of herself. Mason listened to the whole thing. Then he said, Did any of them actually say why? No, that's almost the worst part. Nobody had the decency to say the real thing. They just removed themselves from proximity. He nodded slowly. I think people are very good at telling themselves a story about why what they're doing isn't what they're actually doing. That's a generous way to put it. It's not meant to be generous, he said. I think it's actually a fairly damning thing to say about a person, that they'd rather build a comfortable lie for themselves than say something true to someone who deserved the truth. She looked at him across the table. I've done it too, he said after a moment. Not in the same way, but I've avoided saying things that needed saying because the saying was hard. I'm not exempt from it. She appreciated that. The fact that he hadn't used the observation to position himself as better than the people who'd left her. He'd said what was true and then turned the light on himself as well. And the combination of those two things felt more like honesty than most of what she got from people with better social polish. Ella met Arya in the 8th week, by accident. Mason had a minor plumbing emergency at home that ran long enough that Mrs. Kowalski had other obligations. And rather than cancel, he told Ella they'd stop at the diner quickly on the way home from a late orthodontist appointment, just to keep the week feeling like itself. He hadn't thought through the collision course until Arya's wheelchair was already navigating through the door, and Ella, who had been drawing on a paper placemat with borrowed crayons, looked up. Kids either went quiet and stiff around the wheelchair, or they didn't. Ella didn't. She looked at it with frank interest for a moment, and then looked at Arya's face and apparently decided the face was more interesting. "You're the lady Dad's been having dinner with," she said. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Arya looked at him with a faint expression that might have been amusement. "I am," she said to Ella. "I'm Arya." "I'm Ella. He doesn't usually have dinner with people. Usually it's just him and the empty plate." She said this without particular delicacy, the way kids state facts they haven't been taught to soften. "He says the plate is for my dad, my real dad, who went away." "I know," Arya said. "He told me about that." Ella processed this. "Did he tell you, I think my dad's probably not dead? My uncle thinks that too, but I don't think he knows. I know he thinks that." Mason set down his fork. "Ella." "What?" "It's true. It's complicated." "I know it's complicated. I'm almost 9, not 4. She turned back to Arya. "Do you think he's dead?" Arya looked at the girl steadily. "I think when someone loves the people they leave behind the way your dad loved you, they find ways to hold on." Ella seemed to weigh this. "That's not exactly an answer." "No," Arya said. "It's not. I'm sorry. I don't think you need me making promises I don't have the right to make." Something shifted in Ella's expression, a slight relaxing, some low-level wariness standing down, like the honest answer had passed a test. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing. Mason looked at Arya across the table. She gave the smallest possible shrug as if to say, "I have no idea either." He almost laughed, which surprised him. It had been a while since he'd almost laughed about anything involving Noah. He caught the almost laugh, and it felt strange, like finding a room in a house you'd forgotten was there. The shift in Mason's feelings happened so quietly, he almost didn't notice it was happening. It wasn't a single moment, the way it was supposed to work in the simple version of things. It was more like a slow accumulation. Thursday after Thursday, the corner table, the 2 plates that now sometimes became 3 when Ella was along, the particular texture of talking to someone who expected you to be a complete person and made you feel, without trying, like you might be one. He noticed it first in the negative space. The hours between Thursdays had started to feel slightly different, longer, maybe, or more pointed in their length. He caught himself, while reviewing structural drawings at his drafting table, arriving at the end of a paragraph of specifications and realizing he'd been thinking about something she'd said 2 evenings ago. The observation she'd made about the old couple at the pie case, "I want to be that comfortable with silence someday, and I'm honestly not sure I know how to get there." He'd been chewing on it for days. The honesty of it. The gap it revealed between the version of herself she'd constructed for public consumption and the version she was willing to show him at a corner table in a rainy diner on a Thursday evening. He didn't do anything with the noticing. He wasn't sure he had anything right to do. His life had not been designed with room for this, and he'd been the architect of that design, deliberately, because Ella needed stability above everything, and Mason had long since concluded that most things that felt like forward motion were actually just new forms of distraction from the job. But the noticing persisted, and then came the Thursday in November, when she arrived at the diner looking unlike herself. The composure present, but clearly working harder than usual, the controlled surface visibly effortful in a way it normally wasn't. She ordered her coffee and wrapped both hands around it and was quiet for a while before she spoke. "I have a situation with the acquisition," she said. Sterling Capital was in the middle of a large commercial real estate purchase, a regional portfolio of mixed-use developments across 3 states, the kind of deal that had consumed most of her professional attention for the past several months. She'd mentioned it obliquely several times without going into detail. "What kind of situation?" "I've been doing due diligence on the portfolio, pulling records, reviewing title chains, looking at the full ownership history." She paused. "Some of the parcels in this portfolio have a complicated history. Shell company layering, unusual title transfers, holding companies that existed for one transaction and were dissolved afterward." Something in Mason's chest went very still. "How far back does the history go?" he said. She met his eyes. "Far enough." "Arya?" "I'm not sure yet," she said carefully. "I'm not making a claim I can't support, but there are names in these records, company names, not personal names, that I've seen somewhere before." She turned her coffee mug. "I've seen them in public filings related to Meridian Growth Partners." The name sat between them like something physical. "How many names?" Mason asked, and his voice was entirely level, which required effort. "Right now, 3 confirmed matches. I have a forensic accountant reviewing the full filing history. I don't know yet what it means or how deep it goes." "But you're telling me now." "I'm telling you now because you deserve to know the moment it becomes something more than a coincidence." She paused. "I also wanted you to know before I go further with the investigation, because once I start pulling this thread, if what I think is in here is actually in here, I want you to understand what that could mean." "What do you think it could mean?" She looked at him steadily. "I think it could mean that whatever Noah found 5 years ago wasn't contained the way those men believed it was. I think they may have been moving assets and restructuring entities to insulate themselves for years. And I think if that's true, there may be records in here that could tell us more than the police investigation ever did." Mason sat for a long time without speaking. Outside, the lake was quiet tonight. No rain, just cold November air pressing against the glass. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Right now, nothing. Let me get the full picture first." She hesitated. "I know what this feels like to hear. I just want you to know I'm not going to let it go." He looked at her. The diner hummed around them, ordinary and warm. At the other end of the table, the second plate sat untouched. "I know you won't," he said. And the thing he hadn't let himself acknowledge, the noticing, the accumulation of Thursdays, the room he'd found in a house he thought he'd sealed, pressed against the inside of his chest and stayed there, patient and persistent, the way true things tend to be. He didn't say anything about it, but he stopped pretending, at least to himself, that Thursday was just a habit. The forensic accountant's name was Gerald Fitch, and he was the kind of man who got genuinely excited about shell company layering the way other people got excited about sports scores. Arya had used him on 3 previous acquisitions, and his value was not in speed. Gerald moved at the pace of someone who understood that mistakes in document review cost more than time, but in thoroughness. When Gerald Fitch said he'd found something, it was something. He called her on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after she'd first mentioned the records to Mason. "I need you to come in," he said, which was Gerald's version of "this is significant." He never asked for in-person meetings unless the screen wasn't enough to hold what he was looking at. Arya cleared her afternoon and drove to his office in the financial district, a 3rd-floor space above a dry cleaner that looked exactly like what it was, a place where a meticulous man had spent 20 years accumulating filing systems and the particular organized chaos of someone who worked alone by choice. Gerald met her at the door with the expression of someone carrying a heavy box and glad to finally set it down. The table in his back office was covered, not cluttered, Gerald didn't do clutter, but covered in the deliberate, architectural way of someone who had laid out a case. Documents in sequence, highlighter marked, with handwritten annotation tabs and a color coding system Arya recognized from previous engagements. Post-its with arrows. A whiteboard on the wall behind him with a diagram of entity relationships that looked, at first glance, like a family tree for something that had grown wrong. "How bad?" she said. Gerald pulled out a chair. Sit down. She positioned his wheelchair at the table's accessible end. He sat across from her and folded his hands. The portfolio you're acquiring, he said, has a clean surface. The current ownership is structured correctly. Filings are current. Nothing that would have stopped a standard due diligence review. He paused. But the chain of title on 11 of the 23 parcels goes through a series of holding entities that were systematically dissolved after each transaction. What that means is the paper trail was designed to end. Whoever structured these transfers wanted the history to look like it started fresh with the current owner. But it didn't. No. He turned one of the document stacks toward her. I traced 9 of the 11 chains back to a single originating structure, a parent entity that operated under 4 different names between 14 and 6 years ago. Meridian Growth Partners was one name. Before that, it was Halcyon Land Trust. Before that, 2 others. He pointed to the whiteboard. This is what it actually looks like. Arya studied the diagram. The entity tree branched and rebranched, subsidiaries and holding companies, and dissolved LLCs nested inside each other like a set of boxes specifically designed to make the innermost one invisible. Who are the principals? She said. That's where it gets interesting. Gerald picked up a separate folder. Most of the signatory names are lawyers acting in representative capacity, which is legal and standard and also makes it much harder to identify the human beings who actually owned and controlled these entities. But there are 3 points in the history where direct principal names appear. Gaps in the insulation, essentially. He opened the folder. 3 names. One is a man named Clifford Bain. He's a real estate attorney who died of a heart attack 8 years ago, so that trail's cold. The second is a current executive at a private equity firm called Carver Group. His name is Dennis Holt. He paused. The third name is connected to a current city planning official. The room was quiet. What's the official's name? Arya said. Victor Salz. He's deputy director of the county land use office. Gerald looked at her over his reading glasses. He's been in that role for 6 years. Before that, he worked in private development consulting. His consulting firm appears as a signatory on 2 of the title transfers during the Meridian phase. Arya was silent for a moment, processing the shape of it. A private equity executive. A public official with authority over land use permits and zoning decisions. A dead attorney who had presumably served as the structure's legal architect. And 11 parcels of real estate that had been systematically sanitized of their history before being packaged into the portfolio she was considering buying. If I purchase this portfolio as structured, she said, what am I inheriting? Potentially nothing, Gerald said. The surface is clean, but if a federal investigation ever touched these entities, for whatever reason, the chain of title on these parcels would become contested. At minimum, extended litigation. At maximum, asset seizure of property connected to criminal proceeds. He took off his glasses and set them on the table. I would not buy this portfolio without full disclosure and renegotiation of the acquisition terms, or I would not buy it at all. I'm not buying it, she said. Not the way it's structured. She looked at the whiteboard again. Gerald, does any of this connect to a missing persons case from 5 years ago? A man named Noah Reed, who was reportedly last seen in the county. He was a property attorney. Gerald's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but the particular look of a man being asked to extend a map he'd already been drawing. I don't have a specific connection, but the timing of several of these dissolution events clusters in a window that starts approximately 5 years ago and runs about 18 months, he paused. Someone was cleaning up at scale. Whether that cleanup had anything to do with a specific person is outside my lane. I know, Arya said. I'm just making connections. She left Gerald's office with copies of everything and sat in her car for 15 minutes before calling anyone. The problem was that what she had wasn't evidence of a crime exactly. It was evidence of deliberate structural opacity, which was suspicious but not illegal in itself. The connections to Meridian, and through Meridian to whatever had driven Noah Reed underground, were suggestive but not documented. What she had was a thread. What she needed was someone who knew how to pull it without alerting the people on the other end. She called a number she didn't use often. A woman named Renata Chu, who had been a federal prosecutor for 12 years before going into private practice, and who Arya trusted precisely because Renata had a rare quality among people in her profession. She told you the true thing even when the true thing was inconvenient. I need your read on something, Arya said, hypothetically. You never call me for hypotheticals, Renata said. I'm calling you for one now. She laid it out. The entity structure, the dissolved companies, the three names, the timing. Renata listened without interrupting, which was how Arya knew she was paying close attention. Hypothetically, Renata said when Arya finished, if a person had this information and wanted to do something useful with it, they would not go to local law enforcement first. They would go to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, or the U.S. Attorney's Office, because what you're describing, if the principals are who you think they are, involves a public official, which makes it a federal matter. And hypothetically, would a private citizen bringing this forward be protected? Depends on what they're bringing and how it's used. If it's the predicate for a federal investigation, yes, there are mechanisms. She paused. Arya, is this actually hypothetical? I'm working on it. Work faster than them, Renata said. If these people have been managing this for 5 years, they're not amateurs. The moment they have any reason to believe the documents are in play, they will move. Mason came to the diner that Thursday, not knowing what Arya had learned. She texted him only, "See you at 7. I have something." The brevity of it had sat in his stomach all day. He was there at 6:45, 10 minutes earlier than usual. He'd already gone through 2 cups of coffee by the time her wheelchair came through the door. She came to the table and didn't take off her coat right away, which meant she was still running on the energy of the thing she was carrying and hadn't fully settled. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Methodically, the way she handled everything important, not dramatizing it, but not minimizing it either, just laying out the shape of what Gerald had found and what Renata had said and what it meant in terms of what came next. Mason listened with the stillness he brought to things that required his full attention, which was a different quality of stillness than his ordinary quietness. His hands were flat on the table. His coffee sat untouched. When she finished, the diner carried on around them. Diane refilled the water glasses without being asked. At the counter, a couple argued pleasantly about whether to share the pie. "Dennis Holt," Mason said. "That name. I've seen it. Not on anything that went to the police. In Noah's personal papers." He paused. He kept a notebook, not on his phone, paper. A small thing, blue cover. He left it at my place the last night I saw him in person. I thought he'd forgotten it, and then after he disappeared, I held on to it because it was the only physical thing he'd left behind that wasn't already in Ella's memory box. He was quiet for a moment. "Holt's name is in it. 2 pages. Noah's handwriting. It's the name at the top of a list." "A list of what?" "Names, company names, numbers I never fully decoded. I always assumed it was documentation of what he'd found, but I didn't know who the names referred to. I never had the context." He looked at her. "Now I have the context." Arya absorbed this. That notebook is evidence. It's a dead man's handwritten notes, or a missing man's. In a federal investigation, it's a document. It's a connection between a named individual and a conspiracy that was being actively concealed. She leaned forward slightly. "Mason, if Noah knew about Holt specifically enough to put his name at the top of a list, Holt is private equity, his money moves in ways that are hard to trace, then Noah was further into this than whatever triggered the initial threat against him." "Yeah," Mason said. He said it quietly, the way you say something you've known for a long time and are only now saying out loud for the first time. "I know. I always suspected he knew more than he'd told me. I think he kept me as separate from it as he could to protect me. And Ella. Especially Ella." They were quiet for a moment. "The notebook is at your house?" Arya said. "In a lockbox in my bedroom closet, along with some photocopies he'd made of filing documents. I kept everything. We need to get it to Renata. Not copies, the original, handled correctly so it maintains evidential integrity." She paused. "And we need to do it before we pull any more on this thread. Renata is right. If Holt or Salez have any reason to believe documents are in play, they will move faster than we can." Mason turned his coffee mug in his hands. "If I give that notebook to a federal contact, the investigation is no longer in my control. Whatever happens, happens at the pace of a federal process." "Yes." "That could take years." "It could. And in the meantime, if they're spooked, whatever they know about Noah's location, or what happened to him." "I know," she said. "I know that's the risk." He was quiet for a long stretch. Outside, a car pulled into the gravel lot, headlights sweeping across the dark water of the lake for a moment before going out. "The reason I still come here every Thursday," he said slowly, "is that I made a choice 5 years ago not to stop, not to let the silence become a conclusion. And every time I almost convinced myself to stop, the thing that kept me coming back was the idea that if Noah was alive somewhere and watching, if he knew what I was doing, that I hadn't written him off, then keeping the ritual was a message. It said, 'I'm still here. Come home when you can.'" He looked at her. "Giving that notebook to federal investigators is a different kind of message," he said. "It says, 'I'm moving. I'm not waiting anymore.'" Arya held his gaze. She didn't rush the moment or try to manage it for him. "Do you think he'd want you to move?" she said. The question landed differently than she'd intended it to. Or maybe exactly as she'd intended it to. She wasn't sure. It was the question underneath everything, the one that had been sitting in that corner table for 5 years alongside the untouched plate. Mason looked at the second setting across from him. The plate wasn't there tonight. Diane had said only one, because Ella had come last week and seen Mason without the ritual and said something that had quietly cracked something open in him. "You don't have to set it every time, Dad. He knows you haven't stopped. 8 years old and already somehow past him in understanding." "Yeah," Mason said. "He'd want me to move." He said it like something that had finally broken the surface after a long time underwater. Not with relief exactly. It wasn't clean enough for relief, but with the particular quality of a decision that has been reached the hard way, and is therefore solid. "Okay," Arya said. "Then we move." The handoff to Renata happened that Saturday, in a coffee shop 2 towns over that Arya had chosen for reasons of practical anonymity. Mason brought the lockbox. Renata had brought a colleague from her former U.S. attorney contact, an assistant federal prosecutor named Kim Dawes, who had the practice-neutral expression of someone who had learned not to react visibly to things that warranted reacting to. Dawes went through the notebook's pages without touching them directly. She'd brought nitrile gloves. And her neutral expression tightened slightly at 2 different points, which told Mason more than anything she said. "This is useful," was what she said. She said it the way people say things when the understated version is doing a lot of work. "What happens now?" Mason asked. "We verify what we can verify independently. If the connections hold, we open a formal preliminary inquiry. That's a controlled process. Nothing public, nothing that flags to the subjects. The inquiry either escalates or it doesn't." She looked at him. "I need you to understand that whatever you've been doing on your own, the research, the private investigators, this conversation with Ms. Sterling, all of that has to stop now. Entirely. Nothing that could compromise the integrity of what we're building." "Understood. I also need to be honest with you about something, Mr. Reed." She paused, and for the first time the neutral expression had something else behind it. "The scope of what Ms. Sterling has uncovered, combined with these documents, suggests a structure that was deliberately maintained over many years by people with both the means and the motive to protect it. If your brother was a threat to that structure..." She stopped. "I'm not going to make you a promise I can't keep. What I will tell you is that if he's alive, and if there's any record of what happened to him inside this structure, we will find it." Mason nodded once. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was keeping something contained. They left separately. In the parking lot, Mason and Arya sat in his truck for a few minutes without going anywhere. The Saturday afternoon traffic moved past on the main road. A kid on a bike wobbled between parked cars. "How are you doing?" Arya said. It was such a plain question that it almost caught him off guard. He'd been braced for something more. Some form of processing or strategizing. The plainness of it landed differently. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I feel like I just handed off something I've been carrying for 5 years and now I don't know what to do with my hands." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My physical therapist told me something in rehab that I've thought about a lot since." She said the hardest part of recovery isn't the work, it's accepting that you're not in control of the pace. That your job is to do the right things and then trust the process, even when the process is too slow for how much it matters. Did that help when she said it? Not at all, at the time. She paused. It took about 2 years before it did. He almost laughed again, that same surprising, rusty quality, like something waking up from disuse. 2 years, he said. Good. I'll pencil in the feeling better for about the same. She looked at him sideways, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way she probably didn't intend to show. Outside the truck, the ordinary Saturday kept going. Inside it, something had shifted between them, or hadn't shifted so much as clarified. The accumulation of Thursdays had become something with weight and definition, the kind you couldn't call accidental anymore and couldn't easily put back in the box of casual friendship. Neither of them said that yet, but it was there, taking up space, patient the way true things are when they've decided to wait you out. The 2 weeks after the handoff to Renata were the strangest Mason had experienced since the first weeks after Noah vanished. Back then, the strangeness had been the roaring kind, sirens and police reports, and Ella crying in a way a 3-year-old shouldn't know how to cry. This strangeness was quieter, and in some ways harder to sit with. It was the strangeness of having done the thing, and now having nothing to do but wait. He went to work. He reviewed load calculations for a mid-rise project downtown, and caught a miscalculation in a contractor's beam specification that would have caused problems 18 months from now during a renovation phase. He picked up Ella from school. He made dinner 4 nights out of 7 and let Mrs. Kowalski bring over her inexplicable but genuinely delicious pierogi on the other 3. He helped Ella with a social studies project about local government that involved, with terrible irony, a section on county land use planning. He did not call Renata. She had been clear. She would contact him. Contacting her was the kind of thing that created problems he didn't need. He did not do any further research on Dennis Holt or Victor Salles. He deleted his search history and closed out the browser tabs he'd accumulated over 2 days of compulsive looking after the Saturday handoff, because Kim Dawes had said everything stops, and Mason Reed, whatever his flaws, was a person who did what he said he would do. He went to the diner on Thursday. Aria came at 7:15. They talked about things that weren't the investigation. Ella's social studies project, a bid Mason was preparing for a new commercial contract, a board meeting Aria had navigated that week, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 hours in a room with people optimizing for the wrong outcomes. The conversation had the slightly deliberate quality of 2 people who had agreed, without saying so, to give each other a space that wasn't about the hard thing for 1 evening a week. It helped more than Mason had expected. What helped almost as much was the Thursday routine itself, the diner, the corner table, the second plate. He'd been afraid that handing off the notebook would hollow out the ritual somehow, that the action of moving would make the waiting feel different, make the empty seat feel more final. But it hadn't. If anything, the ritual felt more honest now than it had in a long time. He wasn't just keeping a vigil anymore. He was doing something. The plate was still there, but it was no longer the only thing. The call from Renata came on a Tuesday evening, 23 days after the Saturday handoff. Mason was in the kitchen helping Ella with long division, which was going about as well as long division usually went, when his phone buzzed. He recognized Renata's number, excused himself, and walked to the back porch, closing the door behind him. "We've made contact," Renata said without preamble. He gripped the porch railing. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of November night that made the stars look like they'd been put there recently. What does that mean? It means the preliminary inquiry found enough to open a formal investigation, and it means during the course of that inquiry, federal investigators accessed a set of sealed records that had been maintained by a U.S. Marshal's field office in connection with an active protective detail. She paused, and the pause had weight in it. "Mason, your brother is alive." The railing under his hands was cold and solid and real. He held on to it. "He's been in a protected program for 4 years and 8 months, Renata continued. "He survived an attempt on his life 3 weeks after he disappeared. The marshals picked him up and processed him into protection because he had direct testimony connecting named individuals to a pattern of federal crimes. His case was sealed as a condition of the program." Mason's throat was doing something that made speech complicated. He waited. "He's been maintained under a different identity in another state. He's aware that an investigation has been opened. He's been informed that his family is safe." Another pause. "He's been asking to come home for 2 years. The program wouldn't release him until the principals were in custody or under indictment. That process is now moving." "How long?" Mason said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "The arrest won't happen overnight. These things are built carefully so they don't fall apart in court. But Kim's office is talking weeks, not months." She hesitated. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know. I'm also asking you to hold it alone for now. Not your daughter, not Ms. Sterling, not yet. The fewer people who know the timeline, the fewer opportunities for it to reach the wrong ears. I understand. You doing okay? I don't know yet, he said. It was the same answer he'd given Arya in the parking lot after the handoff. The honest answer when honest was all he had. That's fair, Renata said. I'll be in touch. He stood on the back porch for a while after she hung up. The cold settled around him, and he let it. From inside the house came the sound of Ella abandoning long division in favor of apparently turning on the television, which he would address in a minute, and the familiar small sounds of an ordinary evening, the refrigerator cycling, a car going past outside, Mrs. Kowalski's television faintly audible through the shared wall of the duplex. Noah was alive. He'd known it. He'd maintained the knowing against 5 years of silence and statistical probability and the quiet erosion of everyone around him who had eventually, gently, stopped saying, "I'm sure he's fine," and started saying nothing instead. He'd held on to it with the particular stubborn grip of someone who has decided that the alternative is not acceptable, and the knowing had been right. What he hadn't known, what he couldn't have known, and what settled on him now with a weight that was both relief and something that would take time to fully name, was how much energy the holding on had required. It had been the structural load of his life for 5 years, the invisible stress the whole building was designed around. And now it had shifted. He went back inside, sat back down at the kitchen table, and looked at Ella's math worksheet. "You okay?" she said, looking at him with the unsettling perceptiveness she had developed for his moods. "Yeah," he said. "Sorry, work thing." She studied him for another second, decided to accept this, and pointed at problem 14. "This one doesn't make sense." "Let me see." He pulled the worksheet toward him, looked at the problem, and started walking her through it. His voice was steady, his hands were steady, but somewhere underneath the steadiness, 5 years of held breath were very, very slowly beginning to release. He made it to Thursday without telling Arya. It cost him something. She came in at 7:15, read his face the way she'd gotten good at doing, and said before she'd even taken off her coat, "Something happened." "I can't tell you yet," he said. "I'm sorry." "I will. Soon." She looked at him for a moment, long enough to make the assessment, which she was fast at, and then nodded and sat down and let it go, which was one of the things about her that he'd come to rely on without fully realizing he'd built the reliance. She didn't push what wasn't hers to push. "Okay," she said, "then tell me something else." "Like what?" "I don't know, anything. You look like you've been alone with something too large for 3 days. Talk about something that isn't it." He thought for a moment. "Ella told me this week that she wants to be a forensic accountant when she grows up." Arya looked at him. "Is that because of Gerald?" "She met Gerald at the coffee shop when I brought him to meet you that one time. He apparently explained what he did for 12 minutes, and she asked 6 follow-up questions." Mason picked up his coffee. "I think she was specifically attracted to the part where he said his job was finding things people tried to hide." "That tracks," Arya said, and there was the real smile again, brief and genuine. "She also wants to keep a tortoise," he said, unrelated but equally non-negotiable in her mind. "Tortoises live a very long time." "She knows. She already looked it up. She told me with complete seriousness that if she gets a tortoise now, it will outlive both of us, and she needs to put a provision in her will for it before she's even 9. Arya laughed. A real one, not the managed social function version. And Mason felt it in the same way he'd been feeling most things that came from her lately, like warmth on the side of his face from a direction he kept being surprised by. The evening had that quality it sometimes had, when the hard things were present but not demanding, when they could sit at the table alongside the ordinary ones, and nobody had to perform a feeling they weren't actually having. After Diane cleared the plates, Arya turned her coffee mug and said without looking up, "I need to tell you something." Something in her tone changed the register of the room. "My board has been pushing back on the acquisition exit," she said. "I pulled out of the portfolio deal, which was the right call," Renata confirmed it, "but 3 of my board members have been asking questions about why. The official reason I gave was due diligence concerns, but one of them, a man named Pierce Calloway, who's been on the board for 7 years, has been asking questions that are more specific than due diligence concerns would warrant." Specific how? He asked me directly whether my withdrawal was connected to a regulatory inquiry. She looked up. I haven't said anything about a regulatory inquiry to anyone on my board. Renata told me to keep the circle small, so either Calloway is making an educated guess, or he has a source that told him something. Mason set down his mug. Or he's connected to the structure. That's what I can't figure out. His background is clean. I've had him vetted 3 times since I inherited the board from my predecessor, but a board member doesn't ask that specific a question without a specific reason. You need to tell Renata. I'm going to. Tomorrow morning. She paused. I wanted to tell you first because you're the one with the most at stake, and you deserve to know there may be a leak somewhere adjacent to this. The word leak did what it was supposed to do. It tightened the air in the room. If Holt or Salz know the investigation is moving, Mason started. I know. They've been running this for years. They know how to move assets. They know how to disappear documents. I know, she said again, steady. That's why I'm calling Renata at 8 tomorrow and not waiting for a convenient moment. This doesn't sit another day. He looked at her across the table. The diner was doing its Thursday evening thing around them, indifferent and warm. He thought about Renata's instruction. Not Ms. Sterling, not yet. And the conflict between that instruction and the reality that Arya was already in this, had been in it since the first document she'd pulled, had put herself in proximity to people who had made threats real enough to make a man vanish for 5 years. Be careful, he said. It came out more plainly than he'd meant it. Not cautious, not tactical. Just plain, the way you say something to a person when what you mean is you matter. And I don't want anything to happen to you, and you haven't found the right moment to say the whole thing. She looked at him for a beat. I'm always careful. You're strategic, he said. That's different from careful. She didn't have an immediate answer for that, which was its own kind of answer. What neither of them knew that Thursday evening was that 30 miles away, in a downtown office tower, Dennis Holt was in the middle of a phone call that was not going well for him. The caller was Victor Salz, and Salz was not a man who panicked easily, but the thing underneath his voice was moving in that direction. Someone pulled the full entity history on the Halcyon chain, Salz said. One of my contacts at a title company flagged a comprehensive records request 2 weeks ago. I didn't think anything of it because requests happen, but the name on the filing is connected to Sterling Capital. Holt was quiet for a moment. Arya Sterling, her forensic accounting firm, which means she found the chain, which means she knows what's behind the surface structure. The surface is clean. The surface being clean doesn't matter if she traced the chain back far enough. Salah's voice had a controlled edge to it. Holt, if Sterling gave what she found to anyone with federal access, stop. Holt said it once, flat. Don't say anything that completes that sentence on a phone. Silence. We need to understand exactly what she has and who she's talked to, Holt said. Quietly. Without doing anything that creates additional exposure. Is that clear? And if she's already talked to someone? Holt didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had settled into something colder and more deliberate. Then we manage what can be managed. But we don't move until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Panicking is how amateurs get caught. He ended the call and sat for a moment in his office, 30 floors above the city, looking at the lights below with the particular stillness of a man recalculating. He picked up a different phone, a second device, a burner he kept for a small number of specific conversations, and made a call. I need eyes on Arya Sterling, he said when the line connected. Her movements, her meetings, her phone activity if possible. Standard package. Nothing aggressive. I need information before I need anything else. He listened for a moment. I know, he said. Just do it clean. Kina. Arya noticed the car for the first time on a Friday morning, 2 days after her Thursday conversation with Mason. She'd called Renata at 8 a.m. as planned, reported Calloway's unusual question, and Renata had been quiet in the way she was quiet when she was recalibrating something. She'd told Arya to maintain normal operations and said she'd be in touch within 24 hours. The call had lasted 9 minutes and left Arya with the low-grade alertness of someone who had been told to act normal while understanding that normal was currently theoretical. She'd gone about her Friday. Morning meetings, a call with her infrastructure team about a separate project, lunch at her desk, an afternoon review of quarterly projections. The car was a dark gray sedan parked across from her building's parking structure when she left at 6:15. She registered it the way she registered most things, filed and not yet interpreted. She saw it again Saturday morning outside the coffee shop where she met with her operations director. Same make, different plate. That was the detail that moved it from the filed category to the problem category. She texted Renata from the coffee shop bathroom. I think I'm being watched. Dark gray sedan, 2 different locations, 2 days. Different plates, same vehicle type. Renata's response came in 4 minutes. Do not alter your routine. Do not make it obvious you've noticed. I'll have someone on it today. Arya went back to her table and finished her coffee and her meeting with her operations director with the composed exterior she'd spent years building, the one that didn't telegraph the thing going on underneath. Her director talked about supply chain adjustments and subcontractor bids, and she responded at appropriate intervals with appropriate substance, because the work was the work, and it didn't stop. But when she drove home that afternoon, she called Mason. He picked up on the second ring. Something's happening, she said. I think they know the investigation is moving. She heard him go quiet in the way he went quiet when something required his full attention. She told him about the sedan. She told him about Calloway's question. She told him what Renata had said. Are you at home now? He said. Pulling in? Stay home tonight. Don't go anywhere that's not necessary. And if you see the car again? I know, she said. I'm not new to this, Mason. I know you're not. A pause. He stopped. There was a quality to the stop that she recognized from his face sometimes. Something he was deciding how much of to say. Say it, she said. I've spent 5 years watching someone I love disappear because of these people, he said. I don't have a great relationship with not worrying about people I care about. The words people I care about sat in the air of her car. She was parked in her building structure now, engine idling. The structure was lit in that flat, fluorescent way that made everything look slightly unreal. I'm okay, she said. I'm going inside and I'm locking the door and Renata has people on it. Okay. Mason. Yeah. The thing you almost said, the longer version of it. She paused. You can say it sometime when this is over. Another silence, but a different quality of silence from the one she'd learned to read over months of Thursday evenings. This one had something live in it. Yeah, he said, and his voice had a roughness to it that wasn't distress. I know. She went inside. Across town, Renata Chu made 3 calls in quick succession and then called Kim Dawes at the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, in the flat tone of someone reporting a weather event, They're moving. We need to accelerate the timeline. Dawes said, How soon? Before they do something we can't undo, Renata said. The city kept going around all of them, ordinary and oblivious. And in the corner table of a lakeside diner that had no idea it was at the center of anything, the second plate sat in its place through the closed hours of a Saturday night, waiting. The acceleration Renata had called for didn't look like acceleration from the outside. That was the nature of it. Federal timelines moved through internal channels that left no visible surface disturbance, and for the people waiting on the outside, Mason, Arya, the second plate at the corner table, the days that followed felt less like momentum and more like pressure building behind a wall you couldn't see. Renata confirmed the surveillance on Arya within 48 hours. The dark gray sedan was registered to a private security firm with no public profile and a client list that was not publicly available, which meant it was the kind of firm that did the kind of work that required that arrangement. She passed this to Kim Dawes, who passed it to the investigative team, who added it to a picture that was, according to Renata's careful language, developing in a useful direction. What that meant practically was that Holt and Sals now knew something was in play, which changed the calculation without yet determining the outcome. Mason was informed of this on a Wednesday phone call. Renata kept it brief. The surveillance on Ms. Sterling has been confirmed and is now being monitored by federal assets. She's not in immediate danger. This is information gathering on their end, not escalation. But I want you to know the situation is active. Active, Mason repeated. The arrests are being prepared. I can't give you a date. I can tell you it's no longer a question of whether, only when. He thanked her and stood in his kitchen for a moment after the call, hand still on the phone, looking at the refrigerator covered in Ella's drawings and homework, and a school photo of her in which she was making a face she'd denied making ever since. The arithmetic of it settled on him slowly. The arrests were coming. Holt and Salez had surveillance on Arya, which meant they'd connected her to the inquiry, which meant they were managing their exposure, which meant the window between now and the arrests was the period of highest risk. Not necessarily physical risk, Renata had said not escalation, but risk in the broader sense. The kind of risk where things you care about can be damaged in ways that don't require anyone to be in a dark gray sedan. He called Arya. "I know," she said, before he'd said anything beyond hello. "Renata called me too. How are you doing with it?" "Honestly?" A pause. "I've dealt with hostile board members and leveraged buyout attempts in 3 separate situations where someone tried to use litigation as a business strategy against me. I know what it feels like when powerful people decide you're a problem to be solved." She paused again. "This feels the same, but louder. Are you scared?" The question landed directly, the way questions between them had come to land. She considered it without deflecting. "A little," she said. "Not of them exactly. More of the part where the outcome isn't in my hands." "Yeah," he said. "I know that part." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about what Dawes said. That if Noah is alive and in protection, the program won't release him until the principals are in custody, which means the faster this moves, the faster—" She stopped herself. "The faster he comes home," Mason said. "I was going to say the faster your family gets put back together, but yes." He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd helped Ella with long division on the night Renata first called with the news that Noah was alive. He hadn't told Arya yet. He was still holding it the way Renata had asked him to. But sitting with it in silence while Arya was managing her own part of this thing, taking on risks she hadn't asked for, had started to feel less like caution and more like withholding something she'd earned. "Arya," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." He heard her go still on the other end of the line. "Renata called me 3 weeks ago," he said. "When I came to the diner that Thursday and told you I couldn't say yet, this was what I couldn't say." He told her. Simply, without build-up, the way Renata had told him, Noah was alive. Witness protection. 4 years and 8 months, asking to come home for 2 years. The silence on her end lasted long enough that he started to wonder about the connection. "He's been alive this whole time," she said. Not a question. "Yes." Another silence. "And Ella doesn't know." "Not yet. Renata said to hold it until the arrests were made and the program could process the release. I didn't want to tell Ella and have something go wrong before he actually got here." "That's right," Arya said. Her voice had shifted, not away from the conversation, but into something more focused, the way she got when something large required her full organizational attention. "That's the right call. She doesn't need to hold something that uncertain." A beat. "How long have you been sitting on this alone?" 3 weeks? "Mason?" "I know. I'm sorry. Renata's instructions—" "I understand Renata's instructions. I'm not angry." She paused. You've been walking around with the thing you've been waiting 5 years for, and you've had nobody to say it to." The simplicity of that observation, the way it named exactly what the past 3 weeks had felt like, did something to him that he hadn't expected. He wasn't prepared for how much it helped to have someone understand the specific shape of it. "Something like that," he said. "Okay," she said. "I know now. You're not alone with it anymore." The week that followed had the quality of a held breath stretched over 7 days. Mason worked. He picked up Ella. He did the ordinary things that life required regardless of what else was happening. Arya kept her schedule intact. Renata had said maintain normal operations, and Arya Sterling was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. They talked every evening, brief check-ins that had no tactical purpose, but served a different kind of need. On the following Tuesday, Holt made a move that surprised everyone except possibly Renata. Pierce Calloway, Arya's board member, the one who'd asked the too specific question about a regulatory inquiry, called an emergency board meeting to discuss what he framed as governance concerns related to the terminated acquisition. The framing was precise enough to be lawyered, which it clearly had been. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Arya called Renata immediately. "He's trying to create a record," Renata said. "A formal board proceeding that documents the narrative they want, that the acquisition withdrawal was impulsive, possibly driven by personal factors, anything that muddies the picture. If your judgment is questioned by your own board, your credibility as a cooperating party in a federal inquiry becomes contestable. Can they do that? He can try. Whether it succeeds depends on what your board actually believes about you. Renata paused. How solid is your standing with the other members? 6 of the 8 remaining members have been with me since before the accident, Arya said. They know how I work. They've watched me make due diligence calls that cost us short-term and paid off long-term. My track record on acquisition decisions is not a weakness Callaway can actually exploit. Then go to the meeting. Don't avoid it. Avoidance looks like something to hide. Let him make his play and answer it directly. You don't have to tell them anything about the federal investigation. You tell them the truth. Your forensic review identified structural risks in the title chain that created unacceptable long-term liability exposure, and you withdrew accordingly. That's a complete and accurate answer. And Callaway? Renata was quiet for a moment. Leave Callaway to us. Arya spent Wednesday preparing the way she prepared for every high-stakes meeting, methodically, without drama, building the presentation of facts that would make the argument unnecessary. She reviewed Gerald's summary documents, the parts she could discuss without disclosing the federal connection, and organized the title chain analysis into a form that any board member with basic real estate literacy would understand. She asked her chief legal officer to prepare a liability projection on what holding the portfolio would have meant if the contested parcels became subject to federal asset proceedings. She went to bed at 11, which was late for her on a meeting night, and lay in the dark thinking not about the meeting, but about Noah Reed, somewhere in another state under a name she didn't know, aware that an investigation had opened, waiting for the signal that it was over and he could come home. She thought about the 8-year-old girl who wanted to be a forensic accountant and own a tortoise, and had figured out the Tooth Fairy's inflation problem at age 5. She thought about a man who had set a place at a table for 5 years and called it faith rather than denial, and it turned out to be right. She turned off the light and went to sleep. The board meeting lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes and ended without resolution in Callaway's favor, largely because Arya's chief legal officer's liability projection was specific enough and damaging enough that 3 of the members who had come in leaning toward hear Callaway out left the meeting clearly reassessing their position. Callaway made his argument with the polish of someone who had rehearsed it and the underlying weakness of someone whose argument depended on the audience not examining it too carefully. Arya answered every question asked of her and volunteered nothing beyond the question. It was one of the disciplines she'd learned early. In adversarial proceedings, the most powerful thing you can be is accurate and brief. After the meeting, as the board members filtered out, Callaway stopped beside her in the conference room doorway. He was 61, well-dressed, with the kind of careful geniality that had always made her slightly watchful. He'd been an ally, or had performed one, for 7 years. "Good presentation," he said. "Thank you. I hope you understand this isn't personal." She looked at him steadily. "I always assume governance concerns are institutional rather than personal. That's how they should be." Something moved behind his eyes, a reassessment or something colder, and then the geniality resettled. "Of course," he said, and left. She sat in the empty conference room for 4 minutes afterward, letting the adrenaline metabolize, before she picked up her phone and texted Renata. "Meeting done. He made his play. Didn't land." Renata's response, noted. "Stay available tomorrow." Chet. Tomorrow turned out to be significant in ways Renata had not specified. At 6:40 a.m. on Friday, federal agents executed simultaneous arrest warrants at 3 locations. Dennis Holt was taken from his home in the suburb where he'd lived for 14 years, while his wife stood in a bathrobe on the front steps, and their 2 teenage children watched from an upstairs window. Victor Salz was arrested at his county office building before the doors opened to the public, in the parking garage. The efficiency of the location chosen to minimize spectacle in a building full of city employees. The third arrest was a man whose name had not appeared in Gerald's analysis, a logistics executive who had served as the operational coordinator of the asset movement, the person who had actually managed the shell company transactions on the ground, while Holt provided capital and Salez provided regulatory cover. Pierce Callaway was not arrested. His phone was seized under a separate warrant, and by 9 a.m. his attorney had released a statement indicating he would be cooperating with federal investigators. The cooperation, Renata told Arya later, had been negotiated over the previous 72 hours, which explained the timing of his board meeting gambit. a last attempt to build cover before the structure came down. Mason heard about the arrests from Renata at 7:15 a.m., 40 minutes after they happened. He was in his kitchen making Ella's lunch when the phone rang. "It's done," Renata said. "All 3 primary subjects are in custody. The federal investigation is formally active and public as of 9 a.m. He set down the sandwich he was making. "What happens now, Chet?" he said. And the question had a different weight than any previous version of it. "The Marshals Program has been notified. The review process for your brother's release is being initiated today. It's not instantaneous. There's a formal debrief, a security assessment, logistical arrangements. But the obstruction to release has been removed." "How long?" "Days, not weeks." She paused. "I'd suggest you think about how you want to tell your daughter." He looked across the kitchen at Ella, who had appeared in the doorway in her school uniform, one sock on and one in her hand, looking at him with the expression of someone who had learned to read his silences. "You're doing the face," she said. "What face?" "The one where something happened and you're deciding whether to tell me." He looked at his daughter, nearly 9, gap-toothed, sharper than he deserved, and thought about the social studies project on county land use planning, about the forensic accountant ambition, about he knows you haven't stopped. He put down the phone without ending the call and crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of her. "Ella," he said, "I need to tell you something." Her eyes went very still. "Your dad is alive," he said. "He's been safe, and he's coming home." The sound she made was not a word. It was the kind of sound that lives below language, the place where children keep the things they're too young to fully articulate, but not too young to fully feel. She put both arms around his neck and held on, and Mason held on back, and neither of them said anything for a long time. In the kitchen doorway, one sock still in her hand, she'd gone so still that the ordinary morning sounds of the house felt strange around her. The refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the phone on the counter where Renata was still on the line and was, by the sounds of it, choosing to say nothing. Arya was in a meeting when the news broke publicly at 9 a.m. Her assistant sent her a text. "Holt and Sal's arrested. Federal financial crimes. It's on the news." She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and pulled up the report on her phone. She read it twice. Then she stood in the hallway outside her conference room for a moment, holding the phone, and let herself have 30 seconds of something she didn't have a clean name for. Relief and exhaustion, and the particular feeling of a thing that mattered being over, which was different from happiness and also better in some ways. Then she went back into the meeting. She texted Mason at 11 when she had a break. "I saw. How are you?" His response came in 2 minutes. "I told Ella this morning. She's okay. She cried for about 20 minutes and then asked if she could stay home from school, and I said yes, and she's currently watching 3 hours of television, and that's fine." Arya smiled at her phone. Then, "How are you?" A longer pause this time. "I don't have the word for it yet. I'll let you know when I find it." She understood that. Some things arrived before the language for them did. Noah Reed came home on a Thursday. It was not planned to be a Thursday. The logistics of the program's release process were indifferent to the symmetry. But it worked out that way, and Mason, when Renata told him the travel date, had a feeling he didn't examine too closely. Some things you let be what they are. They'd agreed on the diner, not because it was dramatic or symbolic in a constructed way, but because it was the place that had held the vigil, and it seemed right to let it also hold the ending of it. Mason had called Diane the day before and asked quietly whether he could reserve the corner table for a private party Thursday evening. Diane had said yes without asking why, which was one of the things about Diane. Mason was there at 6:30, 30 minutes early. Arya arrived at 6:45, not her usual 7:15. Tonight she'd adjusted without being asked. Ella came in behind her, in her good sweater, her hair brushed with an effort that was visible and which Mason had decided not to comment on. They sat at the table and waited. The diner filled up around them in the ordinary Thursday way. The bell above the door rang at intervals. Diane brought coffee without being asked. At 7:03, the bell rang again. Mason didn't look up right away. He'd been doing the thing he did, watching the lake, giving himself another second of the before. Then he heard Ella make a sound. Not a word. The same kind of sound as the morning in the kitchen. And he looked up. The man in the doorway was thinner than Mason remembered. and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent years being careful about how visible they allowed themselves to be, a watchfulness that sat in the body rather than just the eyes. His hair was different. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there before, but he was looking across the diner at Mason the way he had always looked at him, like Mason was the fixed point he was navigating from. And he was Noah. Ella was out of her chair before Mason had fully processed what his eyes were telling him. She crossed the diner in the particular full-body way that children move when they've stopped thinking about moving, when the body just goes. Noah caught her and went down to his knees on the diner floor, right there between the tables, and held his daughter against his chest with the grip of someone holding the thing they'd been most afraid of losing. Mason stood up. He walked across the diner and stood over his kneeling brother and the daughter who was crying into his shoulder, and for a moment he just stood there because there were no words that were adequate, and he'd stopped needing them to be. Noah looked up at him. His eyes were wet. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't find it. "You're late," Mason said. Noah made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. He reached up with one arm without letting go of Ella, and Mason took his brother's hand and held it. At the corner table, Arya watched the three of them and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They stayed at the diner for 3 hours. Nobody planned for 3 hours. Mason had imagined something shorter, a reunion, an embrace, the first impossible minutes of a thing that had been 5 years in the making, and then maybe they'd go home, give Noah space to breathe, figure out the rest later. He had not imagined that Noah would sit down at that corner table and that all 4 of them would still be there when Diane started stacking chairs at the other end of the room and pointedly making closing time sounds. The first 20 minutes were mostly just the physical fact of Noah being present. Ella had eventually detached from his neck and climbed into the chair beside him, and then kept reaching over to touch his arm every few minutes, a checking gesture, the way you confirm something is real when you haven't fully convinced yourself yet. Noah let her do it every time without comment. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought you'd never see again, with a kind of careful attention, like he was memorizing details in case the moment became unreliable. He and Mason talked in the uneven, starting and stopping way of people who have years to cover and don't know where to begin. They kept landing on small things first, safe things. Mason told him about a structural project he'd finished downtown. Noah asked about the neighborhood, whether the Vietnamese place on the corner of 5th had survived the pandemic years. It had. Noah said he'd thought about that restaurant's pork banh mi at least a dozen times since he'd been gone, which was the kind of specific, absurd, human detail that made Mason feel, more than anything else in that first hour, that his brother was genuinely back and not some careful reconstruction. Arya sat mostly quiet through the early part of the evening. She had the instinct, good instinct, Mason thought, watching her from across the table, to let the space belong to the 3 of them first. She answered when spoken to, smiled at the right moments, and otherwise occupied herself with her coffee and the particular tact of a person who understands that some rooms you step back from so other people can have them fully. It was Noah who pulled her into the conversation directly. He'd been told, in the briefing from the marshal's office during his debrief, that a private citizen had provided the document thread that had opened the federal inquiry. He hadn't been told who. Renata had protected Arya's name from the program's records as a precaution until the arrests were made. So when Mason finally said, around the second cup of coffee, "This is Arya. She's the one who found the records," Noah went still in a way that was different from his general watchfulness. He looked at Arya across the table for a long moment. "You bought it to the right people?" he said. "We did," she said. "Your brother brought me the context. I had the document access. It was a combination." "How'd you find the chain? The entities were structured specifically to avoid tracing." "Your brother told me enough about Meridian that I knew what to look for. And I had a very good forensic accountant." She paused. "You did thorough work 5 years ago. The notes you left behind were enough to know which names mattered." Noah was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that was hard to read. Gratitude, maybe, but also the complicated feeling of knowing that your past actions, the ones that had cost you everything, had ultimately led somewhere other than nowhere. "I want to ask you something," he said to Arya, "and tell me if it's none of my business." "Go ahead." "Why did you keep going? Once you saw the records, you could have pulled out of the acquisition and walked away clean. You didn't have a personal stake in it." Arya considered the question. She looked at Mason briefly. not for permission, just as a beat of acknowledgement, and then back at Noah. "Your brother sat in this diner every Thursday for almost a year before I walked through that door," she said. "He'd been doing it for 5 years before that. Something about that specific kind of refusal to stop. I don't know. It made me want to be useful to it." She paused. "Also, I don't walk away from things I've started. It's a character flaw some days and an asset on others." Noah looked between her and Mason. He had the expression of someone doing arithmetic that was coming out the way he'd suspected. He looked at Mason and said nothing, which between brothers was its own complete sentence. Mason picked up his coffee and didn't respond to the expression, which was also its own complete sentence. Ella, who had been listening to all of this with the focused attention of a child who has learned that adult conversations contain important information, if you pay close enough attention, looked at Arya and said, "Are you and my dad going to be a thing?" "Ella," Mason said. "What?" "It's a reasonable question." "It's extremely not a reasonable question for right now." "It seems like exactly the right time to ask," she said, with the confidence of someone who has decided the adults are moving too slowly on an obvious matter. Noah covered his mouth with his hand. His shoulders were shaking. "I'm going to need you to not encourage this," Mason said to his brother. Noah held up both hands in a gesture of total innocence that convinced no one. Otto. Noah didn't move back into Mason's house right away. This was a practical and emotional decision that they reached without much discussion because neither of them needed to articulate why. The house had been Mason's and Ella's space for 5 years, and walking back into it as a permanent resident would have been its own kind of pressure for all three of them before they'd had time to find the new shape of things. Renata had connected him with a transitional housing resource the Marshals program used for return-protected witnesses. It was a furnished apartment in a mid-rise 20 minutes from Mason's neighborhood, anonymous and adequate, the kind of place that was designed for the specific purpose of being a bridge rather than a destination. Noah moved in with 2 bags, which was everything he had from his program life, and everything he was willing to carry forward from it. The first month was complicated in ways that none of them had fully prepared for. Noah was 34 now, which meant he'd entered protection at 29, which meant the years between had taken things from him that weren't simply recoverable by coming home. He'd missed Ella learning to read. He'd missed her first day of school, both the terror of it and the extraordinary ordinary pride. He'd missed the tooth fairy inflation incident. He'd missed 4 years and 8 months of a person becoming herself, and no amount of telling him about those years, which Mason did, in detail, over many evenings at the kitchen table, gave them back. He was also, in ways he mostly kept managed, not entirely okay. The program had provided a clinical contact for returned witnesses, and Noah had agreed without needing to be pushed that talking to someone was probably necessary. He'd been in survival mode for nearly 5 years. He'd been a man with a different name living a careful, isolated life in a city where nobody knew him, watching himself age in a bathroom mirror while the life he'd actually built existed somewhere else, intact but inaccessible. The relief of coming home was real and enormous. It coexisted with damage that didn't dissolve just because the circumstances had changed. Mason was not always good at knowing how to be around the version of his brother that had come back. He'd rehearsed this reunion in his imagination many times over 5 years, and the imagined version had been straightforward. Noah comes home, Noah is Noah, things go back to approximately what they had been. The real version had a weight and a texture that the imagined version hadn't accounted for. Noah laughed at the same things. He had the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking through a problem. He still ate his eggs in the specific order of yolk last that had annoyed Mason since childhood. But there were pauses in him now, sudden interior distances that would cross his face and then clear, and Mason didn't always know whether to ask about them or leave them alone. He asked one evening in the second week when they were at Mason's kitchen table after Ella had gone to bed. "How bad was it? The worst of it?" Noah turned his beer bottle in his hands. He thought about the question in the way he thought about things, fully, without rushing to a comfortable answer. "The first year," he said. "The first year was very bad. I didn't know if the attempt on my life had been reported back to you as a death. I didn't know if you were grieving or waiting or what. The program couldn't let me make contact, and I understood the reason, but understanding the reason doesn't make the thing easier to live with." He paused. "I had a lot of nights where I went through it all and tried to make it make sense, whether I'd made the right choice, whether coming forward had been worth it, whether Ella would understand someday, or whether she'd just know that her father had disappeared when she was 3. She never stopped asking about you, Mason said. I know, you told me. I mean, even when she'd stopped being able to expect an answer, she'd still bring you up, not with grief exactly, more like she was maintaining a position, making sure you stayed real. Noah was quiet for a moment. She's your kid more than mine at this point. She's yours, Mason said immediately. She's been waiting for you to come back the same way I have. What she learned from me was just information. The fact of her is yours. Noah nodded slowly, and whatever he was holding behind his eyes he kept there, which was his right. I'm going to need time with her, he said, to figure out what it is now, not to replace what you've built with her. I don't want that, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend what we had before is what we have now. It's something new. I just need time to find it. You have time, Mason said. Nobody's going anywhere. It was the most straightforwardly true thing he'd said in a long time. Then, Ella, for her part, approached the situation with the pragmatic flexibility of a child who had been prepared, over years, for complexity. She was not confused about who Mason was to her. He was her dad, the man who had taken her to every appointment and made her lunches and sat with her through the long division and all the rest of it. That was not renegotiated by Noah's return. It was one of the first things she told Noah directly, in the plain-spoken way she had, that Mason had learned to brace for. You're my dad, she told Noah about 10 days in, when he was taking her for ice cream and the conversation had apparently arrived at a moment she'd decided was right. But so is Mason. I'm not going to stop calling him that. Noah had told Mason this afterward, verbatim, with an expression on his face that was still in the processing stage. What did you say? Mason asked. I said that was fine, that I thought she was right. Good answer. I also cried a little bit in the parking lot after I dropped her back at school, which I'm telling you so you hear it from me first. I cried in the bathroom after she called me dad the first time, Mason said. It's a reasonable response. They looked at each other across the kitchen, two brothers who had both been made fathers by the same child, and something in the absurdity and the rightness of it settled between them like a thing that had finally found its correct place. The legal proceedings against Holt and Salz moved with the particular grinding thoroughness of federal cases, which meant slowly but irreversibly. Noah had been debriefed extensively during the program, and his testimony, combined with Gerald Fitch's document analysis and the entity trace Aria had provided, formed a body of evidence that Renata described as substantial. The defense attorneys made the predictable motions. They were denied. A trial date was set for 11 months out. Noah retained his own attorney to manage the civil aspects. There were questions about the property law firm where he'd originally worked, about compensation for the years of displacement, about the formal record of the attempt on his life which had never been publicly documented. These were complicated and slow and important, and also, for the purposes of daily life, largely in the background. His attorney handled them. Noah focused on the rest. He found a job 4 months after coming home, property law again, at a small firm that did residential work, the same unglamorous necessary work he'd been doing before. His supervising partner was a 60-year-old woman named Frances, who had been around long enough to have a general policy of not asking about gaps in employment history, and who cared primarily about whether the work was done correctly. Noah's work was done correctly. They got along fine. He moved out of the transitional apartment in month 3 and into a 2-bedroom rental 6 blocks from Mason's house, close enough that Ella could walk it on days she was splitting time between them, far enough that everyone had their own space. The arrangement had the slightly improvised quality of something that hadn't been planned but was working anyway, which was true of most things that actually worked. Mason and Aria had the conversation in March, 4 months after Noah came home. It happened at the diner, which was perhaps inevitable. They'd continued their Thursday evenings through all of it, through the arrest, through Noah's return, through the strange and necessary work of everyone finding their new position in the changed landscape. The Thursdays had held even when they didn't need to anymore, and at some point Mason had stopped asking himself why and accepted that they'd become the thing itself rather than a placeholder for it. He'd been trying to find the right moment for weeks. The problem with right moments, he'd concluded, was that they were largely a fiction used to avoid saying the thing until you had no more excuses. He didn't have a right moment. He had a Thursday evening and a corner table and Aria across from him. and the understanding he'd arrived at somewhere in the previous months that the accumulation of Thursdays had become the most important thing in his weekly life and probably needed to be said out loud. "I want to say the thing," he said, "the longer version." She set down her coffee. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered. "Okay," she said. He wasn't smooth about it. He'd known he wouldn't be and had decided not to try. He told her that somewhere in the months of Thursday evenings, he'd stopped being able to call it friendship and had been too cautious or too afraid or too uncertain about timing to say so. He told her that watching her navigate the investigation, the risk she'd accepted, the steadiness she'd maintained, the particular quality of caring she'd shown for people who hadn't asked for it, had stripped away the last of the excuses he'd been building to keep the thing at arm's length. He told her that Ella had been right, months ago, with the most unsubtle possible question, and that he owed her credit for getting there first. He also told her that he understood his life was complicated, that he came with a brother who was in the slow process of rebuilding himself and an almost 9-year-old with strong opinions about forensic accounting and tortoise welfare law, and that these were not small variables. "I know what I'm working with," she said when he'd finished. "I've been at this table for most of a year. I've met the variables." "I know. I just needed you to know I know it's a lot." "Mason." She said his name the way she occasionally did, with a slight exasperation that was also entirely fond. "I ran a company through a federal investigation while being surveilled by people connected to organized financial crime. I am not afraid of complicated." He looked at her. "I'm also not going to pretend I haven't been sitting at this table for months thinking the same thing you just said," she added, in the quieter tone she used for things she meant seriously. "I was waiting for you to get there." "Why didn't you just say it?" "Because it needed to come from you first. You had enough things moving around you. I wasn't going to be one more thing pressing." He thought about this, about the specific patience of it, the months of Thursdays, the waiting without pressure, the room she'd made without making him feel the shape of it. "That's a very considered thing to do," he said. "I have my moments." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Outside, the lake was doing what it did in March, breaking up, the surface starting to move again after the locked-down stillness of winter. The light lasted longer now. The diner felt different with it. "The longer version," she said after a moment. "Is there more of it?" "There's a lot more of it," he said. "I have been very patient about not saying any of it." She smiled. "The real one. The one that briefly reorganized her whole face." "Then say it." He did. Arya's integration into the family, such as it was, didn't happen in a single event. It happened in increments, the way real things do. A Sunday dinner here, a school pickup when Mason had a site conflict there, a Saturday afternoon when Noah brought Ella over to Arya's apartment because Mason was working and Arya had mentioned once that she'd always wanted to learn to make proper pho, and Ella had appointed herself the authority on this despite having never made it either. The resulting pho was, by all accounts, only partially successful but completely edible, which Ella declared a victory, and Arya chose to agree with because she'd learned early that agreeing with Ella's declarations of victory was the correct strategic position. Noah and Arya had their own separate process of finding what they were to each other, which took longer and went deeper than either of them had probably anticipated. It started with a conversation in month 5, when Noah came to Arya's office. At his own initiative, he'd asked her assistant for a meeting, and sat across from her desk with the specific energy of someone who is prepared for something difficult. "I owe you something I haven't said yet," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "Not a debt," he said. "More like an acknowledgement. You put yourself in the path of people who had already been willing to make someone disappear. You did that because you found some documents, and because my brother was worth it to you, and Ella is walking around in the world being herself because those people are in custody." He stopped. "I was in a room for 5 years thinking I'd destroyed my family's life by doing the right thing, coming home and finding it intact and more than intact. That didn't happen without you. I just needed to say that to your face." Arya looked at him across the desk. She had the composed exterior, which she always had in professional settings, but something in it softened. "You started it," she said. 5 years ago, when you saw something wrong and couldn't leave it alone. Everything else was downstream of that. That's a generous way to frame it." I told your brother something once about how I don't walk away from things I've started. That applies to how I think about your situation, too. She paused. You didn't destroy your family's life. You protected it at enormous personal cost. The 5 years were the cost. They weren't the conclusion. Noah sat with that for a moment. I'm working on believing that, he said. I know, that's the right answer. She looked at him steadily. For what it's worth, and you can take this for whatever it's worth coming from someone who didn't know you before. The version of yourself you brought back is someone your daughter is very proud of. She tells people her dad is a whistleblower. She has clearly needed someone to explain to her what the word whistleblower means, but the pride is real. He made the sound that was half laugh and half something else, the same sound he'd made in the diner the night he came back. Who does she tell? Her class, apparently at show and tell. He put his face in his hands briefly, which Arya correctly interpreted as not being distress. The trial began 11 months after the arrests, on a Tuesday in autumn. Mason did not testify. Noah did, for 2 days, in the contained and precise way of someone who had been preparing this testimony for 5 years and had refined it through multiple federal debriefs until every statement was stripped of anything that wasn't directly evidenced. He was by every account a devastating witness, not because he was dramatic, but because he was specific. Dates, documents, the exact language of conversations. The kind of testimony that defense attorneys have no good move against because it isn't built on interpretation, only on record. Arya provided a deposition, not trial testimony, which documented her document findings and the entity trace Gerald had constructed. Gerald himself testified briefly as an expert witness on forensic accounting methodology. His testimony lasted 90 minutes and was, according to Renata, sufficiently airtight that one of the defense teams had tried to have him excluded and failed. Holt was convicted on 11 counts, Sal's on 8, the logistics executive on 14. Pierce Calloway's cooperation agreement resulted in reduced charges, a fine, and a period of supervised release that his attorney framed as a victory and that Renata described, privately and accurately, as the outcome of having nothing worth protecting him from. The afternoon the verdicts came in, Mason was at his drafting table at work when his phone buzzed with a text from Renata. 2 words, all counts. He sat for a moment. Then he called Noah. I heard, Noah said. He was at his office. His voice had the quality of someone who had been waiting for a thing and is still catching up to its having arrived. You okay? Yeah. A pause. I think I need tonight to be quiet. Can we do dinner tomorrow? Absolutely. And Mason, yeah. Thank you for the Thursday thing. The diner. I know you probably think it was for me, and it was, but I also think it kept you going when you might have stopped. Mason looked out the window of his office at the street below, at the ordinary afternoon carrying on. It wasn't rational. No, Noah said, but you were never that kind of person. You've always been the kind of person who just holds on. He said it without sentiment, just as an observation, which was how Noah said things that were true. Mason accepted it the same way. Tomorrow, Mason said. Tomorrow, Noah said. Tsum. A year after Noah came home, they went back to the diner on a Thursday evening in October. The 4 of them, Mason, Noah, Ella, Arya. Ella was almost 10 now and had recently obtained a tortoise, which she had named Edmund, after a great deal of deliberation that had involved a handwritten list of 47 candidate names and a process of elimination that she'd walked Mason through over 3 evenings. Edmund lived in a carefully researched habitat in her bedroom and was, by all observable evidence, entirely indifferent to human attention, which Ella had read was normal and correct tortoise behavior and which she respected. She came into the diner that Thursday evening talking about Edmund's eating habits, which was the natural topic of conversation in the Reed household most evenings. She wore her good sweater again, the same one she'd worn the night Noah came home, because she'd decided it was the right sweater for occasions. And she had apparently decided this was an occasion. They got the corner table. Of course they did. Diane brought 4 menus and 4 waters and looked at the table. At the 4 of them arranged around it, with the expression of someone who has watched a long and complicated story resolved from a front row seat without ever being formally told the plot. She turned over all 4 coffee mugs, set the carafe down, and moved off without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. Mason looked at the table. 4 settings, 4 people. The chair across from him occupied by his brother, who was reading the menu with the focus of a person who had been thinking about this diner's chicken and waffles for a long time. Ella beside Noah, leaning against his arm the way she'd started to do when they were together. A casual, unconscious leaning that was its own form of trust slowly rebuilding. Arya beside Mason, close enough that her shoulder was against his, looking out at the lake with the particular quality of stillness she had when she was fully present. The lake was doing its October thing, choppy and gray, the light already going by 7 p.m., the kind of evening that closed down around you and made the lit interior of a small diner feel like exactly the right place to be. "I want to say something," Mason said. "Oh no," Ella said. "Why, oh no?" "Because when adults say they want to say something at a dinner, it's always long." "It's going to be short," he said. She looked skeptical but permitted it. He looked at the table, at the 4 place settings where 2 had been for more years than he wanted to count. He thought about what it had cost to keep the vigil, the long Thursdays, the erosion of hope that he'd had to fight back periodically, like water coming under a door, the accumulated weight of 5 years of faith being asked to carry what certainty couldn't. He thought about a stormy evening and a woman in a wheelchair who had rolled up to his corner table and asked one question that had changed the entire geometry of things. "I spent 5 years keeping an empty seat," he said, "and 1 year ago someone sat down in it and said the right thing, and then someone else came home. And now there are 4 of us here, which is not something I would have predicted or let myself hope for, because hope at a certain point starts to feel irresponsible." He paused. "I don't think there's a lesson in that exactly. I think sometimes things are just contingent. They depend on the specific people who showed up and the specific choices they made. If Arya had picked a different table that night, or if Noah had kept a different last name at the firm, or if Gerald Fitch had been slightly less pathologically thorough, the chain breaks anywhere, and this isn't this." He looked at all of them. "I'm not going to call it anything bigger than what it is. What it is the 4 people I love most are at this table. That's enough." Ella was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that everyone noticed. Then she said, "I also love Edmund." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "Edmund is at home," Noah said. "This table seats 4. He doesn't require much space. Tortoises are not diner animals, Ella. You don't know that." "I'm fairly confident. He's very calm. He wouldn't bother anyone." Arya put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. Mason looked at her, at the way she was trying and failing to keep the laughter contained, and the sight of it did what the sight of her always did. Landed somewhere specific in his chest and stayed there. He'd been right, in part 4, when he'd said he didn't have the word for what the news about Noah had felt like. He'd been finding the words gradually, over the months since, the way you find your way through a new space with a flashlight, not all at once, just what's directly ahead. The word he'd landed on, after all of it, was possible. Not happy, not resolved, not fixed. Just possible. The sense that the world contained more of it than he'd allowed himself to believe. That a corner table in a diner could become the center of something real. That a person could hold on past the reasonable point and be right. That the things you love could be taken and returned and damaged and repaired and shaped into configurations you didn't plan for. And that the configurations could be better than the plans. It wasn't a neat lesson. Life didn't deliver those. What it delivered was moments, specific and contingent, and yours if you were present enough to receive them. He was present. He reached under the table and found Arya's hand, and she held it the way she'd held it in the diner the first time, easy and certain. Across the table, Noah was talking Ella through the reasoning on why Edmund would not enjoy a diner environment, and Ella was countering with what she clearly felt was airtight scientific logic, and Noah was doing the effortful thing of keeping his face straight. Diane came back for their orders. She looked at the table again. The 4 of them, the 4 coffee mugs, the October lake behind the window glass, and something crossed her face that she didn't try to hide. "What are we having?" she said. "4 chicken and waffles," Mason said. Diane wrote it down, then without looking up from her pad, she said, "About time," and went back to the kitchen. Outside, the lake moved in the dark. The diner held its warmth against the October evening. The chair that had been empty for 5 years was occupied by the person it had been kept for, leaning against his daughter's shoulder, arguing about a tortoise. Mason Reed looked at the table and thought, this is what faith looks like when it turns out to have been right. Not triumphant, not clean, just real and present and yours. Enough, more than enough.